Okay. If you're just joining us, welcome. We'll get started in a few minutes. Just waiting for a few more folks to join in. I need to turn off my notifications. Let's see. Still waiting for a couple of folks. Let's see. We are waiting on two people, William and Steve. Everyone okay with giving them a couple of minutes to join in? Cool, thank you. Do we have closed captioning started, Katie? Or it can be automatic. Great. Couple more minutes to let everyone join in. All right. I think we have everybody now. Yes, we do. Hi, everyone. My name is Helena Kesh, and I'm with Oregon Parks and Recreations Department. Can everyone hear me? Just a nod of your head. Great. All right. So everyone should have received the agenda that I emailed out yesterday. We'll go through that, but we'll also have a PowerPoint on display to kind of help guide us through this conversation. Before we begin, are there any questions? We'll go through the reason why we're here. We'll do introductions. This meeting should not be more than 2 hours, and we anticipate holding a couple more after this to make sure that we can draft some rules. All right, so Katie, I think I can go ahead and start sharing my screen if that's okay. All right. So when I share my screen, I will not be able to see you, so feel free to just speak up if you have a question. And just, actually, I can see you on the side of my little thingy here. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes, I saw David nod. Okay. All right, so let's start with introductions. I started quickly, but I will just reiterate my intro really quick, and then we'll go down the list. So again, I'm Helena Kesh, and I am with Oregon Parks and Recreations Department. I am in the Government Relations and Policy Unit. I will go ahead and lead this Rule Advisory Committee, and I have folks from the agency who will help support as well. Katie, you want to go next?
Sure. Katie Gauthier, also with Government Relations and Policy Unit, and I'm here to help with technical support.
Great, thank you. All right, and do we want to start with Adam?
Yeah, I'm Adam Goggins. I am the program manager for crisis services for Deschutes County Behavioral Health in Deschutes County, Oregon.
Great. David?
I am Dave Zahn. I'm currently a volunteer camp host at Detroit. I've retired from the Marion County Sheriff's Office and have worked in the parks a few years prior to retiring as a deputy. So.
Excellent. Justin Thomas.
Good morning. I am Justin Thomas. I'm a licensed professional counselor and have my own consulting business that I did some training with the Parks Department a handful of months ago. So I'm here in that capacity.
Great. Jamin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamin Lee. I am with OPRD. I work as our incident response coordinator, focused on emergency management and officer safety. And for about the last 12 or so years, I've been a park ranger out in the field.
Great. Steve.
Morning, everybody. I'm Steve Shipsey, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Justice. I'm an assistant attorney general, and I'm general counsel to state parks.
Great. Bill.
Good morning. My name is Bill Neitz. I am the managing attorney of the Oregon Law Center Coos Bay office.
Great. Justin Parker.
Morning, Justin Parker. I'm a district manager with State Parks. I'm from the North Coast, and one of the people kind of representing field interests.
Thank you. And Chris Howell.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Chris, in Government Relations and Policy as well in the Director's Office.
And we have Nicole.
Hi, I'm an administrative specialist for agency support at OPRD. I will be taking your notes today.
And Steve, do we have Lydia joining us today?
I thought that was going to be the case, but let me make sure that she has the right login.
Okay.
I believe I just promoted her to panelist.
Okay. Lydia, we're doing introductions. If that's you, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know why my camera's not working for right now, but my name's Lydia Fisher. I'll work on my camera. Yeah, and I'm a clerk with the Oregon DOJ and Natural Resources, working with Steve.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So next topic on the agenda is OPRD's history on park exclusions, and Chris Howell will go ahead and take the lead on this topic.
Yeah, good morning. And first, I just want to start off by thanking you all for making the time, especially when it's beautiful out and maybe there are other things we could be doing on a beautiful summer day. But this is important work, and I'm especially happy that there's such a wide-ranging group with so many different experiences here to help us through a power that the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department has had for many, many years, maybe even from the beginning. I wasn't quite able to unwind it that far, but the power to exclude people from one or more parks for a temporary period of time has a pretty straightforward history in the state park system. I remember when I started working here in the 90s, it was used rarely enough that I can remember the phone calls from our staff in the field about applying it, or the sort of the approach that we would use in exercising this power. It's an enforcement power that we use to address serious violations of park rules or other matters of safety or to protect park properties. We have staff who go through training to be able to enforce state park rules, and an essential part of that training is understanding this escalation ladder, where when we notice a rule violation or other condition that poses a threat to personal safety or the safety of a park property, it starts usually with a fairly low-level contact between our park staff and volunteers and a visitor, and can escalate from there to a written warning, to something that we refer to as a compliance request, which doesn't carry any penalty, no force of law, but it does get recorded as a, hey, I noticed this circumstance, I asked this person to do the following thing, and sometimes even like, here's the response by that person. Things can go up from there to an actual citation, which are not criminal violations. They're more akin to parking ticket type violations. And typically for things like simple violations of park rules, failure to pay fees, dog off leash, noise violations, other sorts of infractions that are explained in a rule book that our park staff are trained to understand and employ, with the goal of protecting people in a park, protecting the park itself and the staff and volunteers who work there. That power to exclude is sort of at the very, it's at the very top of the chain of our authority. So normally we climb a ramp to get there, but there are some cases where a violation is serious enough and needs immediate attention, where we can climb that ladder of enforcement very, very quickly, sometimes in the course of a single visit. It doesn't happen often that way, but it does happen. The training that park staff receive is an actual academy that results in them getting a badge with a number on it that communicates that they have the power to enforce rules. As I said, in earlier, simpler days, this is where I wheel out my little walker and say, back in my day, here's how it worked. Things were relatively straightforward and visitation was at a pretty modest level. The state park system is popular, but never more so popular as it is today. We've been breaking visitation records pretty consistently year on year, and especially in the last 10 years, visitation to parks has skyrocketed. We now provide more than 50 million day visits a year, more than 2 million camper nights a year, and those records show no trend other than continuing to increase. Along with that increase has been an increase in enforcement contacts and an increase in exclusions. So while we're much busier than we've ever been before, and our contacts are getting more and more intense, our rules have not kept up to date. It's been decades since we've looked at what are the standards for exclusions? What is the process for an exclusion? Is it fair? Are we setting guidelines in rules that give clarity to visitors and to staff about what to expect in what provokes an exclusion? How long is the exclusion? How wide a range of parks does it cover, including the ocean shore? and what are my options if I disagree with the exclusion itself. The existing rules are very, very basic, and I don't think it's beyond the pale for me to say they're pretty primitive. Maybe I should stick with basic. And it was recognized a couple of years ago, and we had staff working on improvements to the exclusion system. And then COVID hit, and many of those staff were laid off, and we have not picked it back up until we were reminded through an exclusion that was challenged that our rules are in dire need of improvement on all of those points. When do exclusions occur? How large range of properties do they cover? How long do they need to stay in effect? By what standards? And what is my process for challenging the exclusion itself? So we've gone through quite a bit of history here. The state park system is 100 years old, and exclusions have been part of the toolkit that park staff use for many, many decades. So I'll pause there. I'm checking in with you, Helena, to see if there's anything else you wanted me to cover and to see if there are any questions from the group here.
I think you did well covering the history of where we have been and where we're headed, and the clarity that needs to take place just for visitors and for staff as well. Are there any questions from the group for Chris? Okay.
Great.
All right, so the purpose of the Rule Advisory Committee. So again, just based on what Chris has explained, the Rule Advisory Committee is a requirement for us to ensure that we're inviting community members, different experts from different subject matters to convene and have dialogue about how we draft these rules, so that it's a consensus and we're taking in different perspectives. It's not one-sided, it's not biased, that we're really looking at different opportunities. So we've invited all of you here based on the different backgrounds that you are experts in and that you can support and speak to. This is an opportunity for us to just have dialogue and draft these rules together. And so if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask away. We do value your time, and we appreciate that you took the time to meet with us today. And then like I said earlier, we may meet again twice, but if we finish up early, that's fine as well. We wanted to go ahead and get kind of a glance of if different exclusion rules look like. So I sent a link in the agenda to one in particular. I think I called it Metro, but it turned out to be City of Portland. So we'll take a look at both of those, both Metro and City of Portland's exclusion rules. Let's start with the link I sent you all, because that one should come first here. Let's see. Let me know if you can see that rule on your screen. Jamin nodding his head, yes, okay. So this is City of Portland's park exclusions. And if you had a chance to preview them, great. If not, we can do this together. And I think the important thing about the rules itself is that they're clear and that they're specifically written in like layman terms. We don't want people to have a hard time understanding the language. It should be super clear to visitors that are visiting the parks what we're trying to ensure for compliance. So you let me know. I don't want to insult your intelligence. Do you want a couple of minutes to read it, or do you want me to read it out loud?
Yeah, Helena, if you intended us to see the actual language, what we see is your slide with the link. If you click the link and it opened up in a web browser, you've got to stop your share and restart it to show your browser window. Yep.
Thank you. That's exactly what happened.
Okay.
That's cool.
One option is to share your entire monitor rather than just a window, but I'll leave that to you.
Oh, let me do that. Here we go. Tell me if you could see the park exclusion rules now. Excellent, thanks. Okay, so this is, like I said, City of Portland 20.12.265 park exclusions. And this is their ordinance. And really it's to ensure compliance with rules and regulations governing the behavior, conduct, or activity of users at parks, and to provide for a safe environment for the Bureau's operations, and in addition to any other remedy or right of action allowed by law. Ejections and exclusions from parks are authorized in accordance with this section. And then I'll leave the rest for you to scan through. I'll get past the definitions here. I'll scroll down unless someone says no. Couple more minutes. Okay. So did everybody kind of get a chance to review that? At least the summary of the definitions, which is great. The actual exclusion portion of it, what would qualify as an exclusion, who enforces the exclusion, who writes it, the appeal process, and the modification for the appeal as well. If someone wants to challenge that. So that's one example. And we want to demonstrate another example. And these are for us to consider as a model. So do we, we're looking at these as something that's already in place, something that we can potentially tweak a little bit to fit the needs of Oregon State Parks and see if it works. Draft it up similar. So we'll go ahead and bring up the other, which is Metro. It brings up the same one. I was having this problem yesterday. Hold on. Let me see if I can find Metros really quick. Here we go. Okay. I did not include Metros, but let me put the link in chat. That way you can click on it on your end, and that might be easier for you to view as well. Let me know if you received that link in chat. David nodded yes. Is that link coming up for folks? So a couple minutes to review Metro's exclusion rules.
Out of curiosity,
Yeah.
is it what's within the is it within the scope of this group to discuss, I guess, I don't want to say sentencing, but I mean essentially the terms of exclusion, or because I'm not necessarily seeing, or at least I didn't see earlier, any specifics on like length of exclusion or criteria or aggravating or mitigating factors for increasing or decreasing a potential exclusion.
Yes. Yes, it will be up to this group to decide that as well. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, for some reason, clicking the chat link, the Oregon Metro Gov link still takes me to the Portland.
Does it?
Yeah. Which is really weird. It's the link that you're copying and pasting it would be a bad idea. Oh, I think I see the problem.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, it's on my end, sorry.
No, it's happening to me on my end too. So
Oh,
I
okay.
have to completely open up a new browser and drop the link. It's a weird conspiracy Portland and Metro have going on with that these 2 pages. All right. Everybody have a reasonable amount of time to review that? So definitely some differences between the two. So what are your thoughts? Do you prefer one over the other? Are there things that you like about each one that would be helpful as we write our rules?
Colleen, I think Portland has pretty good detail.
Mhm.
Both of those seem to be, like day use parks. Were you able to find anything from other states or other parks that have overnight camping? Maybe?
I have
I'm not
not
sure.
looked at Washington State. I was going to look at Washington, but I didn't yet, but I can. And other sister agencies as well. I mean, other sister states as well.
Metro and Portland don't have overnight stuff.
Metro does have some overnight facilities, but I think you're correct, David. Portland, I'm not aware of any Portland facility that's an overnight facility. Metro's overnight facilities are up on the Sandy River. Oxbow, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, City of Portland strangely has one campground up on the Sandy as well at Dodge Park. I believe that's about it.
Okay. I can stop sharing unless you want to see the rule up. Do you have a preference? Do you want me to leave the rule up or can I stop sharing? I'll just go ahead and stop sharing. So overnight camping, that was a good point, David. I can look at other states and see what they do for overnight camping exclusions. And I think that, you know, we can say excluded from day use. We can say excluded from park facilities, period. So I think we have a little bit of flexibility on language there. It just depends on the reasoning for the exclusion to begin with. There was some interesting takeaways from, I think, Metro's exclusion, where it was, while you're excluded, you have the right to request maybe a temporary waiver. And that would have to be directly responded to by the director. So that was an interesting nuance that City of Portland did not have. Like once you're excluded, you're excluded, and your right to appeal is that. But the temporary waiver was unique with Metro. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. If we should consider something such or not.
I would say yes on that.
Mm-hmm. Temporary waiver.
I have a brief comment about that too. Sometimes when people have mental health crises, they can have a whole variety of different behaviors that could look very much like some of these that would get someone excluded. And if they seek treatment or have support in pursuing some medication or other supports to help with those symptoms, then they might have an improved behavior and appearance to be in the park prior to that exclusionary period ending.
Great point. Thanks, Justin. Okay.
So we want to discuss what our existing criteria are for OPRD's exclusions. I don't know if everybody's familiar or not. Or
Damon, if you have that up and available, go for it.
sure, I can go over it a little bit, and Justin can probably help as well. He's teaching at Post, but for our own exclusions, our guidelines are, and this is just me summarizing, it has to be a violation of one of our OARs. So it has to be an actual park rule. And it has an appeal process that's written into it at the bottom. The appeal is to the district manager for that park district. It has to be made, I believe, within 30 days. And that gives some room for exceptions or to discuss further extenuating circumstances related to it. So we can't write exclusions currently for just anything. It's got to be for a park rule violation. That said, what we train our officers on is it's the last step. So it has to be done with the permission of their park manager. Usually the district manager is going to be looped in on it. And it starts low with the 30, 60, or 90 day. But sometimes they escalate beyond that when it's a serious threat to visitor or our own staff safety. And what we need to revise, I think, is our appeal process here. And then what we've seen over time is there's some inconsistency because it hasn't been written into our rules of a standard time frame for some violations. Because I mean, as a ranger out in the field, I never wrote an exclusion for a dog off leash, right? I've written it for things that are going to seriously impede on other visitors or our own staff's safety or experience in the park. I think that's important for us to explain to folks if they're not familiar. So, Justin, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I do have the guideline pulled up. I can share my screen. I can share that if that's something we want to do, Helena. I think the gist of it is it needs a revamp. It's like a lot of our state procedures. Over time, things change and trends change and all that. So I think it's great we're looking at it. I think I'll share that in just a minute. I think that I want to share also that a lot of times we have a lot of staff working in remote areas. So when they're responding to an incident, sometimes there's no cell coverage, there's no radio coverage, there's no backup, so to speak, no additional resources are available for a period of time. So staff are in a position where they have to apply the training and the guidelines in kind of a challenging situation. It's not a phone a friend where you can get someone immediately there to bounce ideas off. Sometimes there's that pressure to make a decision, but there's definitely a matrix. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share that, if that's all right with everybody. Especially
Does Justin have the rights to share on Zoom?
Helena, I did send it to you on email if you want to look at it.
Justin can share as well.
Good. Then Justin, go for it. Perfect.
Well, I'll make an attempt here. Happy to do it. Let's see. Not as familiar with the Zoom sharing thing, so let's see.
I'll buy Justin a moment and just say that the other point with the exclusions I've noticed over time is, it's another tool in our toolbox, right? So there's some times where a citation might be the right tool, but there's also a time when giving somebody a fine is actually going to make them more angry in the park and potentially escalate the situation even more. We try to leave folks better off than how we found them. It's part of our mantra or training. But we also recognize that an exclusion doesn't have any fine attached to it. It doesn't have any nothing that will go on the record, right? And so if somebody doesn't have the money to pay a fine, we're just going to make them worse off, and then they're still in the park and doing the behavior that's potentially threatening others. So that's kind of where the exclusion comes in as well. Is the citation isn't always the right tool for that. It just depends on the situation.
Agreed, Jamin. Are you all seeing my screen?
We're seeing our faces.
Okay.
I see your screen.
Order to leave an exclusion officer guideline. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So I wanted to emphasize something from earlier that in our training for enforcement staff, that Chris referenced earlier, we do teach that the last tool is the exclusion, right? That's never the first tool or the tool of convenience. It is used almost reluctantly when other options are not available. I think we're pretty consistent on that point. But we have to train on it all the time because we have a lot of staff turnover, particularly in the seasonal ranger ranks. So I think it's going to be looked at. So if you're seeing that, basically this is an older 2007 guideline. Staff get access to this when they go through the academy. They get a thumb drive or a binder with a lot of these policies printed out. I definitely don't want to read this to you. It's certainly available. Maybe we can put it in the chat and it'll be available for you guys to look off offline. I kind of want to, there's some definition-y stuff, an intermediate step before we go to an exclusion if a citation might not be deemed to be appropriate. There is an order to leave. We do use that for up to 72 hours. That is currently not appealable. It's meant to diffuse a volatile situation and give some cooling off time. The 72 hours could apply, say, to a holiday weekend. That is used sometimes in the parks when exclusion is not warranted or citation is not effective. So that's in there. And then but it'll definitely get this in the chat so everybody can read through it. I wanted to cruise down to, I think was probably most interesting to this group, because there was a question about matrix, like what's more severe, what's less severe for us. And there is an element of subjectivity here because the officers are in the field reading the situation and they're all different. But this is, I'm getting to it here. This is kind of, can you all see the criteria 6, length of exclusion criteria? That's what you're seeing. I think this is the meat of what we wanted to talk about a little bit in this policy for you all, is just the idea that you see the types of violations, which again are summaries on the left column, and then the length of exclusion as a rough suggestion is on the right. Certainly, I think this can be looked at. I think that'd be great to get more opinions on that and how we can improve that. But generally kind of starts out at the level 1, kind of about a month up to a year plus. Those are rare. I would say that I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but most of the exclusions that I see as a district manager are in kind of that 30 to 60 days type. Generally, when we're going higher, there's things like property damage, threats to the public, threats to staff, actual assaults, significant impact to other visitors. Those are the types of things we do that. And generally, this tool is used after other measures are ineffective or repeated conduct. So any comments on that? I'll stop talking and happy to take any questions on how this is currently being used.
How, I guess some of this language is pretty vague in the sense of like aggressive. Specifically, is there any further definition of like, well, what is aggressive behavior versus other forms? Like how do y'all define aggressive, I guess, in this context? Or is there a rubric for that, I guess is what I'm saying?
There's not a rubric. It's when we do at the academy, we give scenarios to kind of give examples of this from the instructors, but not. That's a great question, but there's not a specific like aggressive matrix or a intentional or threatening matrix. There's not. I think we could add some meat to those bones a little bit. Maybe we could have some context there for sure. A lot of the time, an officer who's considering something in the higher exclusion range is probably going to speak with their manager to kind of see what their take is and to kind of diffuse maybe the heat of the moment or something's happening. That's standard practice, is to call their manager, and if they're a manager issuing it, call upline. Sometimes they'll even call the district manager to say, hey, here's the situation, here's what I think is happening, here's how I read it, what do you think? And then we go from there. It's these days it's very rare for an exclusion to be issued without management being consulted. But yes, there is some subjectivity to it. I think that's a fair comment for sure.
Yeah, and it's important to note again that aggressive isn't a violation of a park rule, right, and that's required to write an exclusion. So it has to be in conjunction with, normally an exclusion is going to be for violating multiple park rules, but it would be that paired with,
yes, that's correct,
definitely aggressive behavior towards staff or visitors.
Yep.
So we have multiple scenarios we create for our officer academy where, an actor is being pretty aggressive towards the staff member, but it's designed to teach folks to assess and realize they're not actually violating a park rule. They're not interfering with anybody else. We're going to let them be. because, you know, they're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah, I'd add too that probably 99% of our rural enforcement contacts have no formal enforcement action. It's the simple advisory contact. It takes, based on my experience, it takes a fair amount to even get an order to leave. And we're not a big citation agency, right? That's not something we reach for that tool very often. And it takes even more to get an exclusion. That's not to say we shouldn't improve our process for sure, but I think we're known as a advisory first agency, and enforcement tool, higher enforcement tool secondary. And I think that's a good sweet spot for us. I don't see any change coming out of this for that. Yeah. Okay. Well, Helen, I think you got anything else? I think that's what I wanted to share.
Justin, if you can just drop that link in chat if you haven't already, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. I gotta figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and then Justin put in a comment. Justin Thomas put a comment in. Let's see if I can read it really quick in chat.
I can summarize it.
Oh, go for it.
I just turned my video off because I was typing on my phone. So right now there's a huge push and change in rules and process for mobile crisis response across the state of Oregon. And I'm a part of that group that is putting forward our first mobile crisis academy, actually, so that all counties and their mobile crisis response teams are trained in a consistent manner. And I think it's going to be extremely important for this group to figure out, how do we work in some language around knowing what the resources are in each county, so that if you have a situation at a park that looks like mental health or substance driven, what are your options in getting county crisis response to come out and actually help intervene? What are the thresholds for that? What's the availability? There's a lot of things I think that they can offer for support, and those are going to be extremely helpful to decrease the escalation potential in these situations.
That's a great point. And I think that could be folded into some of the work that Justin was talking about and Jamin was talking about with POST and the resources when they train officers and staff. But I think that we can always tie that into the policy or procedures that follow the rule, so that there is kind of that matrix or guideline, like do this before you do this, kind of a if this then that. Have you checked with your local county mobile crisis? And then making sure those numbers are available and that we have relationships with each of those. I think that's going to be super important as well, because that'll just help the staff have additional tools in that response.
Yeah, that's a great point, Justin. And with my new role, that's one of the things I was planning on, is helping develop a pocket guide for our staff that relates directly to that. And part of what you're speaking to is the 988 number, correct? That's great.
So I put Jamin Lee down for creating. Right, cool. We'll get that summarized. Okay, and so let's dialogue about some of the things that are on the agenda in response to the inclusion reasoning and process. So what's the reason we would exclude? There were some examples there that you saw that Justin and Jamin kind of reviewed. It's really pretty egregious. It's an egregious act before someone gets excluded. And so what does that mean? What's the definition of egregious? What gets to that point of exclusion? And then we can kind of either work from there and go backwards and say, okay, these other things do not reach the level of exclusion. Here are other opportunities for remediation or diffuse the situation. Do we want to start with that? Like, what are some of those definitions of exclusions? I see Jamin nodding his head. Yep. Okay.
Sure. I don't remember the exact details. Probably a good one to start with might be the hate crime on the coast a couple years ago. Justin, are you more familiar with that one than I am? because that was a 5-year. I think it was on the Central Coast.
Was that the one with the restroom?
As
Yeah.
Agate Beach, yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, if anybody else is familiar with that one, you can give a better summary than I can, but it was in relation to a hate crime.
Hey, Jim, I'm not super familiar with that one.
Yeah, so yes. One visitor attacked another. There was an altercation in a bathroom where a transgender female who still presented as male was in the women's side of the restroom. It's before we started developing standards to remove those kinds of designations from the restrooms. Another woman in the restroom complained to the male that was with her about that encounter, and the male visitor beat up the transgender woman to the point where she required hospitalization. There was an actual crime there that resulted in arrest and conviction. Before the conviction, we issued a short exclusion, and we followed up with a longer one to that 5-year limit. But I think at the beginning, because we didn't want to interfere with the judicial process, our initial exclusion was relatively short, even given the, I think that one is an easy, egregious violation because of the harm that was done to another human being. I think many of our other instances are going to be like, I can't imagine anything more severe than that. Well, I can, but I don't want to. And everything else sort of falls below that in severity.
Chris, this is Justin. Can we maybe talk a little bit about the Beverly Beach registration booth incident? That was, I think, was another one on the higher end of the severity spectrum.
Yeah, and the only one that's coming to mind involved firearms. Do you have one you wanted to share there? Is that the?
Yeah, that was the one I was speaking of. That was another one where I don't know the exact length of that exclusion. I don't recall off the top of my head, but basically it was a visitor that was on the higher end of our exclusion time because he physically threatened to shoot staff and came to the registration booth with a firearm, looking to actively find staff to shoot, essentially. So law enforcement came and diffused the situation, but it was a very tense moment where staff were taking cover, and their assumption was he was ready to act on his threats. And so that was pretty scary for those staff. So not quite active shooter, but leading that way. So that was one of our higher ones. So thanks.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. And oddly enough, that's that scenario. The violation wasn't that they were armed. It was the fact that they were harassing staff because we don't have the power to exclude firearms from state parks. Oddly enough, it's like, I think one of our charges here with this group is to figure out where the line of our authority really is and to draw it clearly for staff so they can enforce and stay out of the criminal realm. That those sorts of things that are going to maybe need to be treated by the sheriff or the state police in concert with the district attorney. We need to make sure that we're not interfering with that in any way. I don't know if you have anything you want to throw in there, Steve. Staring at you intently, but you can't see me staring at you intently.
No, I didn't have anything to add there.
Out of apologies. Out of curiosity, are y'all engaged in like threat assessment or participating in like local threat assessments in your respective districts? Or then I know this isn't a policy related issue. I was just more of a procedural thing.
It's the closest relation we'd have to that is our professional officer academy. So the field scenarios that we do each week, that would be the closest we would get to that, I think. We have 10 to 12 scenarios based on real incidents that happen in parks that new officers are required to go through week 1 and week 2, and they're assessed and graded on that in order to receive their commission.
So we established that Oh, go ahead. Somebody say something? Or is that my voice just being echoed? Probably. We established hate crimes, right? So visitor to visitor, and also like just the situation at Beverly Beach or the threatening of staff. I'm glad Chris clarified that we as an agency do not have authority in telling folks they can't bring firearms to state parks. That's not what we're talking about here. It's just the threat to staff. So we can make that very clear in our language as well, or just make sure that we're not confusing anybody by that either. So I want to make sure our language is plain and easy to understand, that we're not saying, hey, you can't bring your firearm to a state park when you're out camping and stuff. Any other types of behaviors that would constitute exclusion? And we don't always have to consider person to person. We can consider the natural resource, cultural resource considerations.
I think the cultural resource
Yeah.
was key.
Arson is the other one that comes to mind that I've written them before as well. Significant natural resource destruction. So somebody comes in and cuts down a bunch of trees in the park or something like that.
Significant natural resource destruction. And so we'd have to, like, that's a little subjective. What does significant mean, right? And then what are we talking about? Like, are we also talking about, because we're also stewards of the state park properties in relation to tribal lands. And so some of the looting that takes place on tribal, on that as well. What are your thoughts on
Very
that?
good point.
With Bullard's Beach, there was an incident, I think, with Community Church Group was doing a scavenger hunt of some sort, and we're digging up a burial site, a known tribal burial site. And so there was no penalty there. And the tribes, of course, were just beside themselves. And any thoughts to that? Like the natural or cultural resources piece? You're good with that, Justin?
I'll put one other one out I think we should look at, and that may be kind of a narrow one, but fires. So people who build fires where they're not allowed, or during fire season, and they start fires on park properties, which is happening more frequently. And the impact of the landscape and other homes and things, that's pretty risky. And if people are not following those rules, we'd like to educate them, but sometimes it's post incident where they have a fire somewhere where it's not allowed, and it burns a bluff, or it burns for somebody's house, or sometimes it's even happened people's property, other people's property. And then I think that's one I would suggest we would look at having fires in there somewhere, or not following fire season regulations, because there's a huge risk to the general public and our resources.
Okay.
It's becoming more common, sadly, to have fires in the parks like that.
That makes a lot of sense. How big of an issue is illegal camping, and like homeless folks kind of navigating to the fringes and illegal camping and those kinds of things?
It comes up quite a bit, and it's a statewide thing, but we train our officers to not. We don't have a standard for it. That's something we're here to address, right? But we don't train our officers to write it for illegal camping, because that's not the kind of thing that is going to affect the direct safety of staff or visitors. That's going to be something we train staff to work with them on and come up with good options and develop a timeline for them to find better housing. But it's not typically the kind of thing we're going to go to an exclusion for. But I think having it written in will be great.
No, and I was just thinking about the fire. We have a lot of fires down in it mostly BLM land is what it turns out, but that's kind of what brought that thought to mind.
So fire resulting from like an illegal campsite, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't, like Jamin said, exclusions are really, like, from the state park perspective, are more than likely always an egregious act. So it's defining what that means, so that folks have a clear understanding. If you do this, here are the consequences of your actions when it comes to an exclusion. Any other thoughts on criteria for exclusion, behaviors, or activity?
We're talking about any kind of harassing behavior, or I don't know if we mentioned that specifically. That's kind of on the lower end of the spectrum. I would think. I think there's something in there to where you tell someone to leave someone alone and then they continue to engage them further. Harassing or stalking or anything like that occurs.
Yeah, one of our OARs addresses obstructing, harassing, or interfering with a park employee or peace officer in the performance of their duties. There's another one that speaks to that for visitors as well. I'm trying to find that section 4 of our OARs, which one of us can probably find a link to. We can post that, but section 4 goes through visitor conduct and rules regarding that. But the one that comes up is a person may not injure, mutilate, deface, damage, harass, or remove any park resource, property, structure, or facility of any kind at a park property except as provided in OAR 736-010-0055.
I'm going to share my screen really quick so I can show that.
Do the current rules have a wording on failure to remedy the issues, such as like noise or the campfire you're talking about, where you provide the warning and nothing changes when you walk away?
I think the rule just lines out what's required, but the exclusion would be the follow-up potentially for something like that, because we don't have it in our rules for repeated violation. It's just if they violated the rule, then that's what they did.
Okay. So is that too vague for the rangers to work with?
I think the guideline that I shared talks about repeated, conduct of the similar type, but I think it's a good point to consider how if it continues to happen, it might be. We do have some folks that visit the parks that, we are a fee for service camping model, and sometimes folks habitually don't pay, and they're all across the spectrum of backgrounds and things. And sometimes people have been excluded because they habitually don't pay. Like, there's just they've been talked to, they've been given a warning, it's been explained, there's been some grace given, and their plan is to not pay or repeatedly not pay. And so I have seen exclusions come through, like 30-day exclusions. I think is probably the number one when they're just unable to pay, and that speaks to our business model a little bit of fee for service, but it takes a while to get there. A lot of times that documentation is in like a campground log or a ranger station log, a booth log, to show how staff have been repeatedly trying to get compliance with that rule, and it's not forthcoming, so they might reach for that tool in that situation.
So that's a good point there. If like habitual, non-payment, does that reach the level of exclusion? Do we want to include that? Like, that would that constitute an exclusion of 30 days? Would that constitute an exclusion of 60 days? The habitual use. I mean, that's not a crime like person to person or a hate crime or destruction of anything, but it's lack of follow through with the actual visitor conduct administrative role. What are your thoughts on that, folks?
So before we jump into that, just wanted to mention that because exclusion, that power exists, as you've already been discussing, in the context of all of the other rules. So I'm wondering if it might help for the RAC, especially for the second meeting, if we were to take that grid approach and say, here are all of the rules where a violation might lead to an exclusion. And here's the kind of violation of that rule that might lead to an exclusion, and try to be as specific as possible. So harassment, for instance, is a rule well, we don't want to infringe on somebody's speech. And it's like what one visitor might view as harassment might be protected in some way. So let's describe what conditions have to exist before we consider a harassment violation as eligible for exclusion. Does that make sense? And do that for all of the rules that we think a violation could be severe enough to justify an exclusion. And that would give you something maybe to sink your teeth into.
Chris, I like that idea, and I see a lot of people nodding their heads as, being that overarching objective of being clear and kind of layman terms behind the rule. It would be a rule that we would want to maintain frequently every time we, for example, adopted a new rule, like, or the drone rules underway. And if someone is continuously harassing a wildlife protected site, would that rise to the level of exclusion? And we'd want to always be taking a look at anytime we do rulemaking, whether that's something that needs to be worked into that matrix.
I think those are great ideas. And I think one of the approaches we have to take with our new incoming officers is, how do we word this to where there's an understanding that the exclusion is a tool that's available, without making the matrix look like if they did this, they get this, because that's something we always try to avoid. Personally as an officer, it's like, I don't want to write any of that if I don't have to. It's a lot of paperwork. And if we can resolve it on the lowest level possible, that's where we're going to go. And that's where training is based on. So I think that's an important point too. We need to be sensitive to the discretion part, because some folks will see the matrix and say they did this, we need to exclude them. And that might not necessarily be necessary sometimes.
I wonder if we should formalize in the matrix, check with your upline manager, before issuing it, either like verbally or on the phone before you issue an exclusion. That's kind of the current practice, but I think occasionally it doesn't happen. Generally it does. And it can also be amended later, but I think that second opinion is important for consistency.
Okay, that's a good point.
Pending on cell service. Again, sometimes they have to drive 4 hours to get to service or whatever. So this depends.
Okay, so just to make sure I heard correctly, the existing rules that we have that already spell out visitor conduct, visitor behavior, we would take those and put them into a matrix of sorts, a grid that really outlines, behaviors that are in those rules that would lead to an exclusion. And then we would potentially assign a timeline of what that exclusion would look like, similar to kind of what Justin showed us earlier, but a little more defining the different terms that are used. And then if we create something like that, I can send that out to everyone in a draft form and we can review it at our second meeting. How does that sound? And I think a couple of other topics that came up was training. And I think training is imperative. Anytime we're creating or updating a rule, it's important that we train the staff in the agency and provide additional tools and resources, especially like Justin mentioned with mental health. And I think they mentioned 988, the mobile crisis information, that we provide that information as well to staff in training. And when the rule is rolled out, we provide training to follow suit. So everybody in the agency consistently is made aware of what the rule is. And then that is enforced, or not enforced, but taught at upcoming post trainings where officers go through training. How does that sound? Okay. I think we probably need to establish that first before we talk about like geography. Or do you think we have enough here to talk about geography? Like how, from what properties are someone excluded from? Should we wait for that matrix to be created to have that conversation? Or can we kind of brainstorm on it right now? Do we want to limit people to the location to where they violated a rule and are excluded from that park property specific? Or do we want to have some flexibility in stating, you know, based on this exclusion, you will be excluded from all park properties along the coast or in the valleys region or the mountainside or statewide? You know, we may have, we currently have issued, yeah, it does depend on the severity of exclusion. I kind of tend to lean on that too, Nicole. But we have issued, correct me if I'm wrong, statewide exclusion, right, Justin? Yeah.
Yeah, the hate crime being a example of one. And then, you know, it really, for us, it depends on where the violation was written. So like in the Columbia Gorge, if somebody is caught breaking into vehicles and stealing people's belongings, right? We're going to write the exclusion. In addition to law enforcement following up, we're going to write the exclusion as well. But, you know, there's 12 parks that kind of are on a little checkerboard along the old highway, right? So it wouldn't make sense to exclude them from one without doing the rest of them as well, because it's kind of all within. So that's usually it's going to be within a certain vicinity. Sometimes, often it's within that management unit, which is a small grouping of parks within one, you know, immediate area. So a lot of times when I was working on the Sandy, it would be for Dabney and Lewis and Clark State Parks since they're right next to each other.
How are you guys tracking the exclusions from park to park? And other parks see who's been excluded?
That's something that we were a little behind the ball on, but in 2020 or 2019, we started building a rule enforcement database. And David, I don't know if you were with Parks when that was just getting up and running, but it's something we've been trying to pick up post-COVID and continue to develop that so that folks, you know, if somebody seriously threatens staff in one area of the state, that'll be something that other staff around the state could potentially look up and see. So we do have a database. It's kind of in its infancy, but we do have that ability now. We're going to continue to improve on that.
Any other thoughts on geography? Is everybody good with waiting to talk about geography after we look at the matrix? Yeah, I see heads nodding. Cool. So can we jump into the appeal process? So someone receives an exclusion. What should the appeal process look like? We saw a couple of examples in City of Portland and Metro. One was, I forgot which one said 5 days, within 5 days of receiving your exclusion, you have the right to appeal it. Another one I think said during the time, the length of exclusion, you have the right to appeal it. If I'm not, I think that's what I read. Other state agencies will do 30 days. Within 30 days of receiving, you have the right to an appeal. That's kind of standard.
That's ours.
That's ours, 30 days.
Yeah.
Thoughts on appeal process initiation?
The 30-day, oh, go ahead.
You're good, Adam, go.
Sorry. The 30-day window, I guess I'm a little bit curious about that. It seems kind of like a shorter window, especially for if we're talking about an exclusion. And I forget what the actual year was, but we'll say hopefully not, but maybe a year. Say there's a year-long exclusion, especially if we have something that's episodic, like a mental health episode. Someone might not be out of a mental health episode for 3 or 4 months. And then theoretically, they might not be able to make an appeal in that time frame or be organized. And so I don't know if there's wiggle room or practicality in fudging that, but I don't know what y'all's thoughts are on that.
I'll let Bill speak first, but then I can talk a little bit about our appeal process if you guys would like.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead. I think we're gonna go lower in the hand here. Oh, there we go. Okay. But I'd like to just make a suggestion that in the appeal process, that the appeal is actually handled by someone who had no role in determining the exclusion or the length of the exclusion.
So the appeal would go to somebody outside of park operations.
Or someone who was not involved in the decision making. with that.
Okay. So like the kind of loose term hearings officer, but not, we don't have to use that word, but the person who reviews the appeal would be somebody outside of the event.
Yes, that's correct.
Mhm.
Yeah. Helen, this is Justin. Can I make a quick comment on that?
Sure.
I agree with that suggestion. I feel like most park managers are going to reach out to their district manager, for advice on these longer term ones, and the district manager may reach out to the region director. And if we've been involved in that process of, suggesting what that timeline should be, and we're also the person who the appeal could go to, I think having someone who's a little more directly involved does make total sense, and it's more transparent. So my experience as a district manager is most of the appeals that I've seen in my area that I get to work in, very few appeals come in. And I believe it's 10 days. I think it's 10 days on the form, but they have 10 days to appeal to the district manager. Unless the district manager had issued the exclusion, then it would go to the region director. But I feel like we should look at that to be more consistent with what other agencies are doing. And but very few, I think I've heard one appeal in my time, and most folks don't choose to appeal.
And I'm thinking, Justin, is there any downside to an expanded window for that? Because I can't really think of any. I think it's just been a number that we've had there, but in the past, I've seen people appeal them beyond that date, and the district manager will still give that person the time of day to discuss. And we have revised exclusions beyond that date before, so I don't see anything wrong there necessarily. My other 2 cents would be the appeal process going to somebody outside that geographic area would be good, but maybe it would be anything beyond a 6-month or 1-year exclusion. Because sometimes you're writing a 30-day one for a minor thing that the district manager is going to be far enough removed and it's a short time frame. They might better understand the dynamics of what's going on in the park and some of the rule violations. But I think for the longer exclusions, I absolutely agree. There's no downside to going, one district over or one region over.
Question, maybe to Adam, maybe to Bill. If the appeal is moved to outside a particular district, and then you're, a client wanting to appear in person, is that an inconvenience if they have to travel to a more distant location? Does that effectively become an impediment to engaging in the appeal? Or, maybe we can think of a way to offer an appeal hearing, to someone who has internet access. But I just, that was the one thing that occurred to me is like, are we doing something proactively to create a more fair process, but in essence, creating a barrier to someone executing the appeal because of the distance?
And I know for a lot of our clients, especially some of our sicker clients, sometimes they'll go into episodes where they definitely need to have intervention and they need to have those kinds of things where there's restrictions in place. But even at their baseline where they're in behavioral control and other things like that, they might not be super high functioning in some ways. And so I think that very well could be an impediment in some ways for folks.
That's a good point. I'm thinking about just accommodations, reasonable accommodations, where if the appeal review process, let's say, lives in headquarters, and there's a reasonable accommodation request for something like this, that we would come to the individual or set up a video at the district office or somewhere nearby, where we would somehow consider reasonable accommodation in the process.
That sounds like a good idea, and I think we could better document the appeal process. I think that's one thing that we don't have in place right now. So when we write an exclusion currently, we include the time frame that you have to appeal, but then there's a write-in for the district manager, and then you put in the address and phone number of their office. And typically the appeal starts with a phone call, in my experience. And I've seen them lifted before, or just as a result of that phone call, but we don't have a way to document the what resulted from that, other than, often it'd be an email that goes out to staff or something. But I think we could formalize that better.
Chris, did you have some thoughts? You had your hand up, and I don't.
Thoughts keep occurring to me, and then people keep asking questions or offering content that resolves it. So a trigger for like when an appeal and review goes outside the chain of command that was involved in the decision, I think that's important. And then second, making sure that the rule sets a standard for that review. So what we've talked about is you shouldn't have to be local to understand the basis for an exclusion. There should be enough documentation, and the rule should direct you to do some fact finding if you're going to be part of the appeal process. And that way the person who's maybe challenging that appeal has access to all of the same information that we do when we made the decision. I think that's important.
Right. I think the standard for the review is definitely important. I think timeline is important. So establishing, the timeline, and I like what Adam was saying, is that some of the situations are episodic and could be 3 or 4 months before somebody has any capacity to potentially file an appeal. So, let's just say, for example, if our appeal date is, you can appeal this decision within 30 days. And we put a disclaimer. If you file after 30 days, and I'm just thinking out loud, please note why. I don't know that I want to necessarily I don't want someone to have to describe their person with a disability to file for that extension. So I'm not sitting comfortable with that, but if we want to sit with a timeline, 30 days, 90 days, but if someone's episodic situation is 120 days, then you've excluded them from the appeal process due to a disability.
Yeah, and I'm with Jamin on that. I cannot think of a substantive reason why we would have a deadline other than our convenience. And if we've done our job in documenting everything and making sure that that information is recoverable for the entire period of the exclusion, and I think that's our obligation, well, what's the purpose of a deadline? I'm struggling. I can't think of one. I don't know, Steve, because we want, if we want our process to intersect cleanly with the Administrative Procedures Act and the appeal process that accommodates, if timelines are important in that context, maybe you can just speak to how those things need to work together anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was the one thing that occurred to me, is to know when someone was going to have to look for a remedy outside the department and what timeline they would be for that. But we can, that's something we can think about as we craft the rule and see if there's maybe it's that there is a deadline, but there's discretion to director or whomever to accept an appeal, an untimely appeal for a good cause. So that might be one way to handle it.
Okay,
But
great. Thank you.
The certainty around when we know where we are in a process is also appealing to me.
Right.
Nice choice of words. Okay, thanks.
Good cause is a very popular term in the appeal process statewide. So that's noted. Katie?
Maybe there's a difference between an appeal and a review, that there's an appeal of the initial decision and that has a timeline, but then that someone could request a review of their exclusion. And that's the thing that didn't have a timeline. And those could be two separate processes, or I mean, it may be the same process, but the review is because the situation has changed, the circumstances have changed, and that's a less administrative process. And so then we don't get into the APA piece. And I don't know if that's makes it less complicated or more, but just a thought.
I think it's brilliant. Yeah.
Justin?
I was going to add that, we have the legacy paper form where we try and cram so much information in the exclusion form. And we're talking about a process that's more virtual, right? And that interface between the legacy form that they're handed and then how they know their rights to move forward with appeals should they wish to. I think we need to probably internally to OPRD, we might consider revising that form, that whatever process we come up with is now on the back of that form. So when you hand that to the person that's been excluded, they know more than just the very blurb. In 10 days, you have to talk to the DM. We're going to try and cram all that information in on a narrow line. And, it's probably raining when we're doing the form, right? We're handing it to them. That maybe it's on all-weather paper. Maybe it's, it explains their other options on the back, I think, in a more robust manner. So I think that'd be something we could look at internally. It's probably high time we revise the form, in my opinion. We're probably going to need to after this work group's done too. So, thank you.
Good point. That's absolutely imperative that we have a very detailed appeal process lined out. Specifically, clearly describes what someone's rights are to an appeal and how they follow through with it. And that we develop a form that, like you said, can maybe sustain the weather or whatever because of the elements. Like, these are things to definitely consider. You don't want to hand somebody a piece of paper that after it gets wet, it's done. And maybe it's a different process. Maybe it's a business card or something, that a laminated type card that you hand somebody and says, if you disagree with this decision, here's a number for you to call. We can kind of come up with different solutions for that as well. I think too, you're thinking about the different types of people who may experience an exclusion and how to accommodate just their ability to process and receive and maintain their documentation, that they may have limitations to space and, not everybody carries a file folder around. So we have to make some decisions based on ease of use and ease of understanding and follow through. Thoughts on the appeal decision made by the agency back to the person. So what's that timeline? Usually you say you will hear back within 30 business days or 10 business days after your appeal is submitted with a response. So again, from an agency perspective, how long does the agency need to research and do fact finding and determine whether or not there's good cause, or if there isn't, if it's substantiated? Thoughts on that? And Steve, is there an actual window where the state agencies have already a prescribed response time?
Not one that I'm aware of, but
okay, and we can plug that in when we find out. And then after us, if let's say we substantiate the exclusion, the office that's doing that substantiates the exclusion, then that person has the right to pursue an appeal through the administrative law judge, correct? The administrative law process?
If we were, yeah, so that's one of the questions, is it's either through the administrative law process, or if it's handled as an order, what they call an order, other than a contested case, then judicial review would be in the circuit court in which the citation was issued, or the exclusion was issued. I would think that would be a trial de novo before a judge.
Okay, so if they appeal the decision with the agency, then it's a legal.
Yeah, so if we set up a process as what the would be deemed a contested case, then if someone was dissatisfied with the outcome of a contested case, then appeal of that would be judicial review by the Oregon Court of Appeals, as opposed to a trial de novo at a circuit court. And that would be an on-the-record review by the court.
Okay. Is there a preference, one way or the other, which one we pursue?
I'd be interested in Bill's perspective on that. I personally prefer judicial review by the Court of Appeals because I think the issues are fairly narrow in that, and it can be, there's no statutory timelines within which the court would have to act, but that's also true in a trial de novo at a circuit court. I think putting on a trial for everybody at a circuit court, if we provided a decent process within the agency, then kind of repeating that from the start. Honestly, you're not going to get through either of those processes for an exclusion that's less than 5 years before the court reaches its decision. Would be more concerned.
Yeah, good point.
We're talking about, this is going to be, we're going into OARs now, right? So I'm not sure the difference between going to circuit court or going to administrative court. And I'm not sure here, but if this goes to circuit court, is there any danger of like a criminal conviction if the person loses at circuit court versus going to administrative court where there's no danger of that? And I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that's a good consideration. I mean, the only danger of criminal or violation would be if that was separately charged. I think there may be, so statutorily there's at least 2 circumstances I can think of where we automatically have to have an exclusion, and that's where someone's been convicted of a bias crime. Or first or second degree. So there's those 2 instances, but in that case, the exclusion occurs after the criminal conviction. We get notified by the court that this has been a result of a criminal case, and then we're obligated to take that exclusion. The other place where we would want to think about it, I think, is if we had looting of archaeological or cultural sites happening in one state park. And that was, that occurred to me as one of those instances where that might be a place where it wouldn't be a park by park issue. You'd probably want to take a step to protect the system in that case if you had someone engaging in that activity. But yeah, I think hopefully to get to your initial question, as I'm kind of thinking on the spot here, I think that the exclusion being, generally what Justin and Jamin have been describing is, these are done in lieu of trying to charge someone with a violation of park rule and a fine. So I don't think that we would get into a situation where you would be on review of the park action where at that point a crime or a violation would be brought.
So in other words, in cases of, crimes that cause the exclusion, there would be a concurrent case that would be brought by the district attorney in whatever county that occurred, and that's where any criminal liability would lie, whereas any litigation that is basically an appeal of the exclusion, there's no potential criminal implications for lack of a better word, the defendant in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I'll help clarify just for everybody else in case they're not familiar. Our exclusions are currently internal only. They do not get sent to the court like a citation does. And that's an important one, especially for us. If we don't want to add that to somebody's record, it's essentially treated as a timeout from us. But the penalty for violating an exclusion is a criminal trespass, which if, often local law enforcement are called to help us enforce that, then that can be an arrestable offense. We don't arrest though. So it'd be us presenting to law enforcement. We wrote this exclusion, they violated it, and they can decide whether or not they're going to pursue that criminal trespass.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the appeal process? There was a question in chat by Nicole saying, would there be any reason why somebody would not be able to appeal? And I think from my understanding in state government, everyone has the right to an appeal. Everyone. So there would not be, regardless of what the crime is. It's like just a standard. Everyone has the right to an appeal.
Yeah. I'm sorry, with that possible exception, I don't know how the statute for conviction of bias crime 1 or 2 that result in an exclusion, whether that's appealable at our level or whether that needs to be taken up through some other judicial path. I don't know the answer to that. Because it's not our decision about to exclude, it's just us complying with the statute that directs us to exclude.
Oh, good point. Okay, so we can further decide on that one, but that seems to be the only one that we're directed by to formalize an exclusion based on a hate crime.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so we'll find out the details there. That may be the only one where they may not have the right to an appeal, if that's what it says.
Yep, and the other half of her question, where it would always be granted, I think there would have to be some sort of utterly bizarre administrative error that we issued an exclusion and we know that we shouldn't have. I've never seen that happen before, but I guess it's theoretically possible.
Okay. Let's see where we're at on the agenda really quick. I think we're at the bottom of the agenda, really. Are there any final thoughts before we close? All right, so just to kind of summarize, we will draft, that'll be myself and government relations unit will draft a matrix of sorts that will take the existing rules and the exclusionary aspects of the existing rules and then plug them into a matrix that would then kind of relay what kind of an exclusion timeline, and we can draft something up for review at our next meeting. And I could send that out in advance to give everyone a chance to kind of preview it, add some notes, feedback, thoughts, and we'll also draft the rule itself that lists the appeal process. And so we can start kind of looking at what a draft rule could potentially be, and we could go through that at our next meeting and talk through that. Does that sound all right with everyone? Okay. It's summertime. I know everyone is busy, schedules are busy. I will send out another doodle poll just to make sure that we can all kind of get on the same page with a date that works. And if it so happens that after hours is better, like if there's something in the evening that would work better for everyone, I'm flexible. If you're flexible, just maybe send me an email if I find that we're not aligned on a certain date, I might respond in an email and say, hey folks, what about an evening? I think Katie is gonna maybe host us or something. She's got a really nice deck, I think. Joking. Sorry, Katie, putting you on the spot. So we will come up with a plan. We'll send out a draft, and I will also email everybody a doodle poll to try to figure out our next meeting date. Thank you all for taking the time to meet with us today and spending your thoughts and expertise to help us kind of get to this point. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to getting this rule written. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.